All right, now let's take a look at our database. So simply head over to console.firebase.google.com. On the welcome page, if you scroll down, you can see our Pepper project. So click. Now on the left side, let's go to database. So we're going to store our data here. Now, if you have never worked with NoSQL databases, you may find them a little bit odd at the beginning, because here we don't have the concept of tables and relationships. Our database is basically a tree of objects, or more accurately, a tree of key value pairs. So we basically store JSON objects here that map natively to JSON objects in JavaScript. So when working with a NoSQL database on the backend, we get a JSON object from the server and we simply display it on the client. Or we construct a JSON object on the client and send it to the server, and then it gets stored exactly as is. There is no mapping. Let's take a look at a few examples. So here I'm going to click plus to add a new node to this tree. Each node has a name or key and a value. And this value can be a primitive type, like a number, a string, a boolean, or it can be a complex object. As an example, I'm going to set name to first name and value to mosh. Now note that every time we add a new node, that node becomes green for a second and its parent becomes yellow, which means it's modified. Let's try another example. So I'm going to click this plus, set the name to count and value to 10. Now when I press add, note that this new node is going to be green and its parent, which is Pepper, is going to be yellow. There you go. As you will see shortly, when we delete a node, that node becomes red. Now let's add one more node here, is approved, and set it to true. So here we have three examples. In the first one, our value is a number. In the second, it's a string. And in the third, it's a boolean. But our value can also be a complex object. So let me delete these few nodes here. Note that it turns red for a second, and now it disappeared. One more time. Now this time I'm going to add a new node called restaurant. And for its value, I'm not going to set any values here. I'm going to click this plus. And this allows me to add a complex object. So here I'm going to set an attribute, let's say name. And for the value, I'm going to use Amici. It's an Italian restaurant. Now a restaurant can have an address. So let's click plus here, address. And this address can also be a complex object. So once again, I'm going to click plus. Address can have city, like Melbourne. And here's the result. So we have a hierarchy of key value pairs. That's our database. We don't have tables and relationships. Now let me show you something. I'm going to add a new node under Pepper called cuisines. So imagine in our relational database world, we have a table called cuisines and we have a table called restaurants. And there is a relationship between these two tables. I want to show you how we model that in NoSQL databases. So back here, for cuisines, I'm going to add a complex object. And here I'm going to add a couple of cuisines. Each cuisine has an ID and a name. For ID, I'm going to use 1. And for name or value, I'm going to use Italian. Now, I'm going to add another cuisine here to Indian. So we have two objects under cuisines, which is like having two records in a table. Now, each restaurant should have a cuisine type. How do we implement that here? Well, I'm going to add a new node under restaurant, call it cuisine, and set its value to 1. Now, here's the interesting part. This 1 here is just a number. There is no relationship between these two nodes. In other words, if I delete this cuisine type here or modify it, it's not going to impact this object here. So we don't have cascade update or cascade delete here. Now, let's say in our application, we want to display this restaurant and its cuisine as Italian. How do we do that? Well, we have to do two reads from our database. First, we need to read the restaurant node, then look at its cuisine, it's one, and then we need to do another read to get this node. Now you might want to ask, isn't that slow because we are doing two reads from the database? Not really, because NoSQL databases are optimized for these kind of reads. So the reads are very fast. Now that aside, there is another way to store the cuisine for a restaurant. Instead of setting the value to 1, we can simply set it to Italian. This way, we don't have to do two reads from the database. I know what you're thinking. You're saying, Mosh, you're duplicating data. What if we have a million restaurants? Then we're duplicating this Italian word over and over. Yes, in theory, we're duplicating data, but in practice, that's not an issue these days because disk space is very cheap. And in this particular example, the chances of Italian being changed to something else in the future is almost zero. So we don't have to store Italian in one place. Just in case it changes in the future, we don't have to update a million places. So as you will see over the next few sections, working with NoSQL databases requires a different way of thinking. Alright, next, let me show you how to render a list of objects in an Angular app.